afternoon and welcome to this session of the wonderful Wigtown Book Festival. Thank you all for joining us. My name's Jenny Niven, I'm a programmer and producer, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here this afternoon with the wonderful Andrew O'Hagan. Andrew, welcome. Hi.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi. As you all probably know, Andrew was born in Glasgow but grew up in the mighty Irvine on the west coast of Scotland, not too far along the road from Wigtown. He's the author of numerous works of fiction and non-fiction and long-form investigative journalism. He's editor-at-large of the London Review of Books, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He's been nominated for most literary prizes, including the Booker. And his new novel, Mayflies, has just been published in the last month. And it's such a treat and a pleasure and a privilege to be able to chat to him this afternoon about Mayflies. This is Mayflies. As you probably know, you can get it in the bookshop that Wigtown Book Festival run. And although I'll say this at the end again, but just up front, please do everything you can to support Wigtown Book Festival this year. These are very strange times to be making festivals in, and it's just a triumph that they've been able to bring everything on online, but it's no small feat. So please do what you can to support the wonderful Wigtown. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
What a pleasure. Great to see you. And I must say, I join you, Jenny, in sending a big shout out to the organisers and supporters of Wigtown Book Festival. It's such a fixture in the international publishing calendar now. People, writers especially, couldn't imagine a publishing year without Wigtown being part of it. So I'm delighted to be able to join you with this new book and talk it through with you.
And in fact, Wigtown has a bit of a cameo appearance in Mayflies, but we'll come to that a little bit later on. Could you set the scene for us, Andrew? What's the origin story of Mayflies? Where did the novel come from, and who inspired the great Tully at its heart?
Well, you know, once or twice, I think, if you're lucky in a writer's life, your life hands you a subject. You know, usually you have to sort of spend, in my case, years, sometimes decades, you know, scraping through research libraries and through sort of investigative situations, political or social, to find the stories that seem right for you. But with Mayflies, it came straight from my life. It's my most autobiographical book so far. It opens up in 1986 in Ayrshire, and that was where I grew up, as you mentioned, and I had a bunch of close friends at that time, many of whom are still my friends, growing up in that post-industrial Ayrshire of the time, just after the miners' strike, you know, a time of strife, you might say. Thatcher's Britain was very much to the fore, and there was a form of resistance and an experience of life there in the west coast of Scotland, which hasn't made it into that many novels, or even, you know, dramas or poems, or, you know, Alistair Gray once said something very important, I think, not only for Scottish writers, but for writers all over the world, which is that until you've heard the voices you grew up with on the radio and seen the places that you walked through on the way to school painted in oils and seen your whole reality represented in art, you might have lived there in fact, but you haven't lived there yet imaginatively, as a group, collectively. And that's hugely motivational to people like me, even years after reading that. And Mayflies comes from that world. I had a friend in particular, Keith Martin, who grew up with me. He was in one of the adjacent housing estates. He was in Irvine, I was in Colwinning, and that bus journey as a teenager to his house was full of excitement and promise, because we were young people trying to find who we were and what the world would be like with us in it. And the book really starts with that. 30 years later, I got a call from Tully, which really set our whole friendship into relief. He made an ask of me, which I knew as he said it would become the centre of a novel. So Mayflies really just jumped right out from life, and the joy and the tragedy of friendship, of a Scottish friendship, and what happened to it over those years became the central story of the book.
As you say, it's obviously, you know, the most kind of autobiographical of your novels today. What can you tell us about that process and how you decided what to leave in and what to leave out, and where, you know, where your kind of editorial role in your own story was?
You know, it's one of the strongest traditions in Scottish fiction, just to stick with that, since we're here at Wigtown. You know, that tradition of writers drawing from actuality and turning it into kind of mythic patterns and stories which sort of go to everybody's life, hopefully. That's the idea, is that you create a universal from the particular. And the particular is very often not just your home country and your own town and the language you speak and the particular manners and mores of people who live there, and in a particular time period as well. I mean, Scotland was very different in 1986. The world was. I mean, this is a pre-internet group of friends. They met each other in youth clubs and at bus stops and, you know, sharing bottles of cider on the bus and sort of going to football matches or sharing their enthusiasms for music by meeting in record shops and things like that. I mean, I've got a 16-year-old daughter. She thinks I'm describing a kind of Victorian era when I tell her how, in order to buy a new 45 single, because I only had money for one, I would get up at my bed and Cohen, pull my trousers on, get ready, walk to Co-Winning Station, get a train to Glasgow, walk up Renfield Street, go into the record shop, buy the single, do the reverse journey all the way back home and put the record on my turntable and pull the arm over. Now, 3 seconds on her smartphone would feel like a delay to her to hear a song. So we're talking about a huge difference in terms, not just about technology, but in our relation to other people, because on that journey to the record shop, you'd meet pals, you'd meet people on the way, you'd talk about what you were doing, you'd talk about the music taste, and that's all changed. So in not getting that right, the process of drawing on your life to make a kind of mythic story is a cornerstone of literature. It's, you know, I remember growing up and loving The House with the Green Shutters, set again not far from Wigton, where we're talking about, and Ochiltree, not far from Auchinleck, and just in the south of Ayrshire. And that novel was obviously so full of local character. It sort of took the skin off you, just how intimate and how sort of scorching it was as a portrayal of human life. And it was universal at some level. People could read that in Russia and recognize, or Japan, and recognize the truth of the human relationships described in the book. And that's what you're going for, really. You don't rely on life just because you kind of think of anything else. It's because it has already a kind of intimate language that your ear is used to, and you want to bring it to readers. You also, I think, love the idea that certain parts of the world are a bit under-described. And I feel that still about some parts of the world that I know, the Ayrshire that I grew up in and that I still love, and that whole coast. You know, you want to keep it alive in literature. There it is in Robert Burns. There it is in the novels of John Galt. And I want to keep, in however small a way, keep that imaginative life of the place alive.
I love the sense of place in it, and having grown up in Newton Stewart, just along the road from Wigton, and our kind of journey to the record shop, although there was a wee one, buying tapes in Newton Stewart. But if you wanted to get anything from further afield, it was 70 miles to Bar Hill train station, and then the train up to Glasgow. But you know, that Ailsa Craig on the left-hand side and looking across to Arden and that kind of that landscape. And for me, the link between that and childhood was really, really strong. You
know, W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, often referred to the landscape of the imagination. And each writer has her particular landscape of her imagination or his imagination. And I think that, you know, the question of loyalty to that comes up for a writer. I mean, I still feel that I'm excavating. I mean, I sometimes sit, I need to get a life, but sometimes I sit bolt upright and think, the great Aaron novel, or a novel where somebody sails around Ailsa Craig. I see it in my imagination, you know, the look of the landscape in October, the way that it is on a particularly cold day in January around Alloway or Kyles of Bute or down towards Stranraer. Just absolutely fascinated by that landscape. And it is, as W.B. Yeats said of the west of Ireland for him, it's the landscape of my imagination. So I feel incredibly insatiable in my interest in it. You know, I'm constantly learning new things about it, and I keep a place there. I go back as much as I can. I'll never really tire of it, I don't think.
You used the word loyalty there, which is interesting. And I think about that and the idea of kind of fidelity as well. And if you're writing something that is kind of semi-autobiographical, how much liberty did you feel you had with the truth? Would you think the truth, whatever that may mean, but did you feel when you were writing things that you had to correct it, or maybe that wasn't quite how it was? And in certain areas where I think maybe things from your own childhood that were difficult or whatever. I noticed, for instance, that the character that is kind of loosely based around you in the story, the parents are largely absent in there, although the relationship between father and son is very central to the novel. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you navigate?
Absolutely. I mean, there's freedoms that you absolutely must grasp as a novelist. You know, your readers depend on them. You're not writing the book for yourself or for your family. You're writing it for the readers in the world. I mean, this book will go into other languages. I mean, it's already being translated. And so suddenly Chinese editions or Italian or, you know, French editions appear. And, you know, those questions that seem so political and crucial at the local level, like, will my mommy like the fact that she's not in the book? They're actually, in the larger scale, you know, they disappear. But they're interesting to talk about because I think those freedoms are crucial to the art of the novel, that you will draw from life, but you must know technically where to draw the line. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that facts are observable, but the truth is imagined. Right. To get to the truth, that larger truth, which I think lovers of fiction depend on, you go to a novel because you want a sense of life and its truths at a deeper level, not just a series of facts. Non-fiction can be brilliant and artful, but it essentially deals in facts. And when I'm writing non-fiction, as you mentioned at the top of our session, you know, I'm not only an unshy non-fiction writer sometimes, but a very enthusiastic reporter. And when I'm writing reportage or non-fiction, then I want it to stand up in court. You know, I want it to be factually 100% provable. What we go to fiction for is a deeper sense of the truth, something that exists, if you like, even beyond or behind the facts. The facts don't tell us everything we need to know. If you look at somebody like, an obvious example here, Donald Trump, you know, the facts are that he's president of the United States. The facts are that he was elected by American people. The facts are that he's a successful businessman. But if you look behind those facts and use imagination and proper, as it were, technical investigative devices, you begin to see that quite a lot of the facts in his life conceal who he really is. It would take a great novelist. It would take John Updike or Sorvello or Alice Munro or, you know, Marilyn Robinson to really imagine fully the kind of inner and outer demons which motivate a man like Donald Trump. That's where fiction gets its heart and its kind of spirit from, is the artist knowing where, as it were, real life and imagined life stop and start. It's finding the porous nature of how one can blend into the other. That's most of our work, really. In the end, the reader should have this vital life force in their hands, this little moral conundrum called a novel, which will hopefully enrich their experience of the world. And they don't need to worry about the bloodlines because we did all the worrying for them.
Right. One of the central kind of thesis, I suppose, in the novel is around the idea of male friendship. And it's not something that's explored very much in fiction or in popular culture at all.
It's amazing that, isn't it, Jenny? That, I mean, all the big headlines go to romantic love. You know, the big movies, the big song lyrics, they're all about romance. Whereas another place in the heart, and a very profound place in the heart for all of us, I think, is old friendship, deep loyalty, the kind of friendship which might well be platonic, but it's as important as a force in your life, if you like, perhaps in a different way, that, you know, we depend on them. You reach out to all your life. And I wanted to write, if you like, a fully rounded, beginning to end account of a friendship, which starts in childhood, in that Scottish landscape we were talking about, and ends with, you know, a too early tragedy 30 years later, with those friends, the meaning of the friendship and the dependency they have on each other grows and changes with the decades. And that's something we've all experienced in life. But you're right, we hardly ever find it in literature, especially male friendship. There's books about female friendship where it's thought to be a kind of sub-theme in many novels, you know, the closeness between women, the dependency they can have with each other over a lifetime, but very few. And I actually loved that theme growing up. I was a great, you know, Mark Twain fan. So Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn was very much, you know, a favourite of mine. But also later, Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, the notion of what happens between male friends over time.
The ultimate buddy movie.
Yeah, it was time to update that and come up with a new formulation, because I think it has, you know, masculinity itself has been under pressure, and quite rightly, in recent decades. And notions of what our responsibilities are, of what decency and goodness is among men has changed. From my father's generation, my father met whatever male pals he had, and he didn't have many, doing national service. You know, we didn't have national service. There was this, between the internet kids, my daughter, who meet people online and in chat rooms, and my father's generation, who met people either in the pub or doing national service, there was this generation in the middle, my generation, you know.
Mine, yeah.
Yeah, in yours. And it was just very different because we were pre-internet but post-national service. It was a different Britain in a way, and it's only now that Britain's beginning to find its stories, I think.
Mm-hmm. I was just reading Elena Ferrante's recent novel, The Lying Life of Adults, and she, I think, does friendship masterfully, but so much from the perspective of female friendship. And even that's not actually done that often. And I think her Neapolitana trilogy or quartet was kind of really groundbreaking because it did that real kind of analysis of a female friendship and all the kind of...
important that, scene, isn't it? Because it does... It's almost like it throws the coverlet back on a different way of being, in love, almost. You know, a different way of having a passion for another person, which isn't about sex.
And how it sustains you, and you draw sustenance from it over time.
And a sense of self, a sense of identity. Who am I? Everybody knows that. You know, growing up when you're a teenager, in Ayrshire, as much as I'm sure. In the lowlands and all around Scotland and all around the world, the sense of who you were as a teenager was often a kind of sum total of who your friends were, people who mattered to you. And so I wanted to get some of that into the book. How do you become a person? You know, and as a teenager, it was often about, you know, these admirable heroes who would appear out of the dark wearing a leather jacket and smoking a fag, you know, in a youth club, and you'd be like, oh, you know, I want to be part of that crowd, you know, whatever it is he's got. I see it happening, to say, with, you know, a 16-year-old daughter, you know, the hero worship. And then suddenly that hero worship dissolves into something much more meaningful in some cases, which is a lifelong friendship, where you were actually in step with each other through all the big trials of life, you know, parents dying, you know, marriages, children being born, all sorts of things, you know, disappointments, and also just some of the big public disasters in life that we lived through together. You and I have known each other for a couple of decades now, and we can quite happily talk about, you know, the things we've seen happen in public life together, you know, even at a remoteness. And I think friendships like that, it's nice to look around the room as the years go on and see that there are one or two familiar faces.
Shared content. And writing that story, though, how do you find the right kind of emotional register for that? Because particularly when you're dealing with men from the west coast of Scotland, it's not...
to identify the difficulty of that task.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, my father's generation left us in some doubt about whether male friendship was okay. You know, my father never hugged another man. You know, he would have been quite repulsed by the scene that we now find quite familiar. Boys and fellas meeting up in the pub and immediately hugging each other, or, you know, even some of them kissing each other. You know, there's a lot of that goes on now. And for my generation,
that sort of awkward back slap.
I mean, bless my father's gone now, but I remember, to be quite honest with you, meeting him at an airport once and hugging him. And it was like hugging an ironing board. It was like this sort of slight sense of awkwardness, and it's inappropriate, and, you know, he just wasn't into it. And, you know, I think my generation of men, I can generalize on this point, are just there's just been a massive change with that. You know, there's a kind of emotional availability in my generation of Scottish men that just wasn't there. When I wrote Our Fathers, my first novel, I was essentially writing a novel about a kind of stymied generation, both politically and emotionally, that they were brilliant politically in the sense that they were, you know, there was a great socialist energy in them that mattered to me when I was younger. It still matters to me, you know, and there was a sort of almost heavy industry clarity about making and value and community and, you know, the worthwhileness of daily work. That was all in that generation, but there wasn't an emotional availability. And that's what that novel, Our Fathers, really became about, was the generations of men in Scotland, you know, and how their sense of politics and feeling changed. And, you know, a few books on, I find it still in my mind, you know, that wanting to write a book that was entirely about my generation. It didn't, the fathers in this book are actually somewhat crippled and remote in the Thatcher years. But Tully and Jimmy, the two boys at the centre of this book, grow into men who are as dependent on each other, somewhat controversially, as dependent on each other as they are on their wives. And that's part of the moral conundrum of the book. You know, is how is it possible for these Scottish men coming from that kind of background to require so much of each other emotionally and psychologically when they have wives and these are straight friends. So I wanted to conjure with that for a long time, Jenny, to be honest. I mean, I think it's great raw material for a novel, and something I think that every person, every sentient person can identify with those problems.
I love the way in the novel, you know, you do kind of begin to sort of see what that looks like from an external perspective as well, and the women who are central to these characters' lives and how they deal with that, and also the treatment of humour, because I think there's always that kind of Scottish way of introducing humour into difficult situations. And in some parts in the book, that's characterised as a type of bravery, when I think it can sometimes be the opposite too. You know, it's a deflection and it's a way of kind of avoiding.
I think you're right, you know, and we should allow for that, is that sometimes that humour, which we all love, is a kind of self-protective, you know, it's a way of, you know, being Teflon when under attack, you know, bouncing back difficulties. But humour bonds these people, and the men and the women in the book too. I mean, I feel that Anna and Iona, the respective partners of these men, are in a sense the smartest people in the book. They can see what's going on. They can see what these men are doing with each other, with their friendship, that they're using it as a kind of protective, you know, cloak, which is very much necessary because one of them's in a crisis. Also, there's a kind of old-fashioned male camaraderie bullshit going on, which they want to name it. They want to put up with it and help them to reach the end of their project, which is to support each other to the end. But the women know what's going on and they call it out. And I wanted this to be a Scottish book where the women could see clearly that they weren't victims. They weren't behaving like victims. They weren't allowing themselves to be positioned as victims. They saw it clearly and, as it were, allowed it to go on because, in a sense, it was a situation with great pathos that they decided to get involved in and ordain, but they weren't victims in it. And I think that that's part of our contemporary sense of these things, that I wasn't going to have these women just being sort of like wags.
Yeah, but they endure though, don't they? Scottish women always.
Well, certainly in my books, I mean, when I look back to the beginning, I see that, you know, much as in my life, in fact, it was the women who had the final word and the middle word and the first word. And very often, actually, growing up, I mean, I would look around me and see strong women everywhere, and I see it reflected now in all the books I've written. That even if there are central male characters, this is a book about male friendship. But the women are everywhere strong. I mean, the great friend of their joint friendship in youth is Barbara, Tully's mother, who's far-seeing, original, you know, self-possessed, gives the boys confidence. She's the kind of maker of their freedom in a way. And it's fun as a novelist to play with those stereotypes, you know, because I grew up in a world where, of course, women had a much tougher time in some communities. And I grew up in a working class community where not every woman had her voice, and that's still true today. There's a lot of work to be done. But in a novel, a contemporary novel now, you can start to conjure with some of the changes and the needful changes, and you can implement them as the kind of designer of the story.
Would now be a good time? We're rattling through. We're going to run out of time, I can tell. But would you like to give us a wee flavour of Mayflies?
Sure, it'd be a great pleasure. I'm just going to read from a part of the book when the young crowd of boys from Ayrshire eventually, via Paisley, get on a bus to Manchester to have this wonderful weekend that becomes, although they don't know it at the time, the summit of their youth. This long weekend in Manchester, seeing some of the great bands that they've all loved, you know, New Order, The Fall, Smiths, and so on. And this is when they're in the big concert venue, and the Smiths have just come on. The band was at its height, romantic and wronged and fierce and sublime, with haircuts like agendas. Morrissey came brandishing a license, a whole manner of permission, as if a new kind of belonging could be made from feeling left out, like nobody knew you, like he did. Time takes nothing away from it. Those thousands of heartened teenagers taking the roof off and giving out to a gawky frontman from Stretford. Tully found me and pushed me down to the stage. Over the speakers, the sound was scratchy, but every word and every guitar lick felt like a statement only they could make, and only we could hear. Those songs rolling from the stage to irrigate our lives. That's what it's all about, Tully shouted, and he kissed my cheek and we sang. I could see Limbo at the very front, whirling out of his skin, holding up a smoke and shouting about panic on the streets of Carlisle. Then he was near us and wagging his finger in time to the music, a wonderful look on his face, singing about a vicar, about Joan of Arc, and throwing plastic tumblers into the air. Our hair was soaking wet. The Ayrshire boys appeared from all corners of the hall, and we hugged, and the music soared, and it seemed like a huge animation of the things that mattered to us then. Tibbs and Hogg, Limbo and Tully and Clogs, the full brass of being. Who knew what time incubated or what life would demonstrate? We were there, beyond navigation, floating through the air. We beamed to the rafters and jumped shoulder to shoulder, and the words we sang were daft and romantic and ripe and British, custom built for the clear-eyed young. The singer threw a spotted shirt from the stage, and a group of lads tore it to ribbons and waved the bits like trophies. "He's bigger than Jesus," Tully said. "You reckon?" "A bit funnier." "Definitely funnier," I said. They say you know nothing at 18. There are things you know at 18 that you will never know again. Morrissey would lose his youth, and not just his youth, but the gusto that took him across the stage with a banner saying the Queen is dead is a thing of permanence. We didn't know it at the time, but it was also, for all of us, a tender goodbye. And we would never be those people again. "Check Limbo, check him," Tully said in my ear. And I looked at the edge of the stage where the boy himself was spread over a speaker, climbing. Nobody at that age needs more than what Limbo McCafferty had in abundance. He had vitality. He had the spirit of resistance in that single moment. And as the final encore bristled and rose to perfect confusion, Limbo appeared on the stage, going past crewmen and bouncers to take up residence by the drums, dancing and smiling for eternity. The crowd cheering him on and spiriting the light in his direction. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Was it? It must have just been really quite joyful to write some of those passages, the most kind of exuberant and hedonistic parts of it. Was it? Was it fun?
It's the most fun I've ever had at my desk.
Yeah.
There's some low points to compare it to. Over the years, I've been writing professionally for 3 decades now, and it would be talking among friends, Scottish crowd here as well and beyond. I'd be a liar if I said it was always fun. It's hard work, and it's almost the most difficult thing you can do with your head in your hands in some ways, just trying to magic this new life onto the page, putting something into the world that wasn't there before. But there are times when it's just the sheer joy of what you're trying to describe travels through you. And writing those scenes with the boys in Manchester was just a joy. I found myself sort of laughing along with them, being them in a way. As I said, there's so much autobiography in it that I was revisiting scenes and repopulating them, if you like, with fresh energy. And that was a great experience.
There's a sense of that, definitely, reading it. That comes over really strongly. But you mentioned when we were chatting before this session, Andrew, that you feel that there's something about this novel that has resonated really particularly in the kind of the moment that we're all collectively in just right now in 2020, strange circumstances.
Definitely. I'm surprised and overwhelmed by the reaction to this book. Every day messages are coming from all across the country and from Australia and New Zealand and other places, and the book's reprinting again. And with that sense that people feel that they were waiting for a book, I think, to remind them about loyalty and about scenes like that, where they could be in a crowd with fellow human beings looking in the same direction, their hearts filled with the same belief and energy. There's a hunger at the moment for collective action, for being together. And I think that people have responded to the book, if I can guess. I feel it very strongly. They've responded to the idea that the book is about realizing who the important people are in your life, about, in a sense, recognizing who those life-changing, life-enhancing, sort of eternal people are in everybody's life. And each of us have a sense of that. And I think we're looking for it at the moment. That the pandemic and the lockdown has isolated us in so many ways, both physical but also mental. That reaching out to those important people and, here's a hand, my trusty friend. There's a big feeling for that at the moment. And my trusty friend, gave me a novel. He asked for this novel before he died. And, producing it, well before we knew anything about lockdown and isolation, happens to have fulfilled a promise to him, but also it's met at the other end with a lot of people feeling the same thing. Here's a hand, my trusty friend.
I think there's something about nostalgia too. I think this moment of kind of reflection and forced downtime in a way is allowing people space perhaps to be a bit more reflective than they have in the past. And with restrictions on movement and things, you do think about who you can't see and who you would like to see. And maybe that's people that you can't see because it was 30 years ago. There's that.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the things that is being very much recognised this year, is something that, an institution like the Wigton Book Festival has always known, that people who have a book are never really by themselves. People who think they haven't travelled haven't read enough books, because you're always travelling and you're always meeting and you're always exposing yourself to the unknown and to distance and to difference and to tolerance if you read books. And so it's a good time to be an author of books, weirdly. It doesn't make up for the terrible losses and tragedies and suffering that people are enduring, not for a second. But while we're here, that contemplation that you've referred to, that sense of, traveling through your mind into the places that you can't at the moment reach physically, that's a very pronounced moment. And our national literature is responding to it as much as all our national services. I love the idea that people are picking up a book at the moment for want of company, and long may that last, although we hope the pandemic ends very soon and the isolation is lifted. but people go out and they take their books and their bags with them because it's, I mean, talk about friendship. I mean, I speak as a, former Scottish child. I'm still Scottish, but I'm no longer a child, unfortunately. And that child's whole world, whole universe was opened up by the local library, by the winning library, and what books meant as a kind of freedom fighting implement, if you like. Having a book in your hand taught me how to be a human being among other human beings. And so I hope that, this is probably a place to talk like this because a book festival knows this. Yep. And that's why we have them so magical and so successful as they are, is because they remind people of that basic proximity they have to others through literature.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about class and about the way that's, but we're running out of time. So perhaps I can wrap the kind of questions together in a way, because I wanted to ask you too about, given that the novel does look at young people and this strange moment that we're in, and what would it be like to be 18 or 19 in 2020 when if everything that's happened this year, and then kids starting out their university this term, and Brexit at the end of the year, what a moment, and then
hard. This will go down, I think, as a sort of huge generational moment. We grew up, of course, with our parents talking about the war generation, and we talk of ourselves as the digital generation, that we saw home computers invade our lives and change our sense of reality and money and connectivity and politics and influence. All of that changed because of the technology. I think for this generation of teenagers who have lived and shown great heart, actually, through a difficult time, shown pluck and heart and willingness to connect with each other and to try and overcome these difficulties. A lot of these people studied for exams that they couldn't sit.
Absolutely, I know.
Some of them were insulted by, government attempts to downgrade them or to encourage the downgrading of them. They went through a lot. There's been some restoration in that, but not entirely. And they've lived, I think, with pluck, with courage, and with a bit of character through this difficult time. I'm fully admiring of that generation. As I said to you, I have a 16-year-old, fully admiring of the way she and her friends have taken it on. We had a lot about the millennials and a sense of entitlement, in previous years, but, this generation has linked arms, I think, and long may they do so, and may they march out of lockdown linked arms. The world will make it up to them, I hope. I think that's part of my generation's responsibility, is to make it up to them, make sure our institutions are up to it. That's our universities, our literary festivals, our government institutions, our financial institutions are up to it, that we do good governance for that generation, and that we fulfill that promise, or that statement, again, of Alistair Gray's, when he said, work as if you live in the early days of a better nation. And I want that put on a T-shirt and given out free to every young person who's endured this lockdown.
Absolutely, because that question about social mobility in the novel is really important. And then also I was thinking, like a couple of weeks ago, there was when Shuggie Bain was shortlisted, or longlisted, sorry, for the Booker, and there was
shortlisted too.
And shortlisted, yes. And there was a thread on Twitter, somebody had said, can somebody write a novel about Glasgow that isn't about slums and poverty? And so that conversation started again, the same one that's been happening since the 30s and no mean city. And that's, you've told a very working class story from a totally different kind of perspective, but thinking about social mobility and about young people and about what pathways really are open to folks now, it's...
Well, that was a great personal benefit to freedom for me, Jenny. I got to write the books that I wanted to write. I went to a comprehensive school in the west coast of Scotland, with nearly 2,000 pupils, and and I went to Strathclyde University and had the experience that was open to me. Then I took it, grasped it with both hands, and didn't have any special privileges. Our generation didn't necessarily, but you know what? I got the freedom in the end. I was able to write what I wanted to write. I was able to, investigate what I found to be my reality, whether internal or external, and produce the books I wanted to produce. And I have to say that the education system was behind people like me. Social mobility was, We've still got a long way to go on it, don't get me wrong, but I think, there's the great secret was always, can we produce variety, not just between classes, but within the classes, that we don't want to just produce a series of cliches and it's there about working class life. And I don't believe any of the writers that you've mentioned do that. They've got a new take, they might say, negative or dark images of Glasgow, but this is a book written by a gay man, with a gay central character. That was unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago to have that novel. And so everything's
absolutely
a new announcement. It's a step forward. It's a change. And yes, some of the background material might be dark. Well, the Russians aren't afraid of that. The French aren't afraid of that. The American novel isn't afraid of that. Why would we be afraid of it? There's darkness in life just as there's light. And, writing this book was a joy because there was so much light. But yes, as Saul Bellow once said, death is the dark backing on the mirror that allows us to see anything at all. We're all headed the one way. Let's not be afraid of that darkness, but populate the light while we're here.
Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but we do have a couple of quick audience questions. Nice. David says, in the book, there are two important moments, periods of time. I rushed through the first half a bit like I did the 80s. Were there other periods you had to write or imagine in the history which you then discarded? And he says, by the way, I get the train from Sanquhar to Glasgow via Newcomnock. You've forever changed the way I think about that journey.
Dealing with two periods is always technically quite a challenge. I mean, there are many great examples in world literature through the centuries, but taking readers, it's a big ask of readers to invest them in a period, as I do here in the 1980s, and then take them to 30 years later, very, very sort of unapologetically to 30 years later in the characters' lives. That's quite a big ask. But you know what? It's what happens in life. Have you ever met somebody in the street that you haven't seen from school, and suddenly there's a kind of narrative technical difficulty? Do you still know them? You knew them in class. You might have even been their pal. You might have gone out with them and snogged them around the back of the bike shed. But now you're in this strange, do I know you? Or what is the knowledge between us? And that sort of moment occurs in life all the time. We live, not just in any one period, but across, if we're lucky, across an expanse of time. So the novel should know technically how to take you across expanses of time. So I had to work at it and make sure that, for example, in the earlier part, in the 80s, those boys know nothing of the technology that would define them later.
Right.
So you can keep that from them. And, that's just a very obvious technical point, but that's how you do it, just by sort of concentrating really hard on their particular reality.
And there are ways you can do that in books and in fiction in a way that you can't perhaps, or you would do differently on television, for instance, or other mediums.
That's in fact quite a germane question, Jenny, because I'm able to announce here to you today for the first time, and it will be in a press release any minute now, that Mayflies has just been bought up to be adapted for a television series. And so it will probably be a British and American co-production, but by a Scottish company, I'm very proud to say, Synchronicity Films, and who are fantastic international class producers of quality drama. And they, against much competition, I have to tell you, they managed to buy this, and they're producing it, imminently. So I'm absolutely delighted about that, and delighted to be able to tell you about it today.
That is wonderful news. That's terrific. And I hope Twitter is immediately abuzz with guesses of who will play you in the TV adaptation of Mayflies.
Well, as I say, I only have one concern, which is that I want an upgrade. Insane as that is, that's all I want.
We've got just time to squeeze in this last question. It's from Malcolm. He says he grew up in the late 50s, early 60s in a small South Ayrshire town. And like you, Andrew, I had close male friendships. But moving away for further education brought to an end the closeness of those friendships. Therefore, I envy you. And I wonder how you managed to hold on to friends in the way you describe.
I think that there's so much to say about that, and we don't have time. I mean, it's like a whole seminar subject. How do you hold on to your old friends? Primarily by trying not to be an arsehole. That would be my piece of advice number one. That your reality might by force, be very different from the friends that you grew up with. And theirs is different from each other's too. I think the arsehole part comes in when you assume that you've sort of, that your narrative is somehow the only one that you can recognize. I recognize their narratives, if anything, more than mine. I've got friends who stayed pretty close to the town that we grew up in, but they've got really, really busy, interesting, complex lives full of children, partners, relationships with the past, deep concern with their national questions and international questions. My pals have just, we've continued to be on a level. That's the truth. And that's the answer to that nice question is, find a way to stay on a level, for all your differences. And they can be massive. They can be geographically massive. They can be politically or socially massive. But if you stay on a level, then we're effectively the people we were. We're looking at each other with the same eyes. The eyes are still there. They haven't changed. They've aged a bit, but they're still as they were.
It does feel like an especially good moment to kind of dig those things out, doesn't it? And
I think so, Jenny. You don't. Some of these verities we're talking about, they're a bit universal, and they're a bit long-lasting. It's not just, oh, it's a subject for a book that I wrote, and I'll be onto something else in a minute. I'll never be onto something else. I'll be onto other books with other narratives, but this material will live with me all my life. Not only because I drew it from my life, but because it goes to the very basis of, being alive on Earth. To me, what is your relationship with other human beings and with the past? How do you build a life? How do you live a life? Which is the subject of so many novels that we care about, perhaps, but this one for me will always be close to my heart because it brings me back constantly and in a progressive way. And I encourage that notion that you can be brought to the past progressively. It's not nostalgia. The past is never the past. It's just an enlargement of the present. And to me, this book will always draw me into company with questions and with people that really matter to me, things I love.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It was just a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today about the
Thanks, Jenny.
Mayflies. Thanks to everybody who's watched or listened today, and please support Wigton Book Festival by donating and supporting and listening to them, but also by buying books like the wonderful Mayflies through the Wigton Festival.
If I could just say a word, Jenny, again, joining you. I want to say thanks to all the people who have joined us today. I know that it's an unusual way to communicate with each other, and I look forward to being back in the town and back at this wonderful festival and seeing you face to face and raising a dram at the end, as I wish I was now. I'll go off and do that anyway. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye now. Thank you.